I have no memory of Berlin. I was 2 years old when we left Berlin. My family is Jewish. After Kristallnacht, my father realized that we had to leave, and he tried to find a place where he could go. And it was difficult at that point to find a country that would take us, but the British did agree to take us. The British actually accepted more refugees from Germany and Austria at that point than any other country. I think that in about the year leading up to the beginning of the war and for a short period after the war, the British accepted about 70,000 Jews trying to leave Germany and Austria. My older sister had gone to England first. She was 8 years older than me, and so at the age of 10, she went to England on the Kinder transport. And she was there for a few months before the rest of us were able to go. We actually arrived in England on August 16, 1939. So it was about 2 weeks before the beginning of the war. And at that point, the British were concerned that there would be spies and saboteurs among the refugees. And so they interned the men, some for brief periods, some for longer periods, on the Isle of Man, and eventually had them identify each other and then release them. So because my father was subject to internment, he actually wasn't interned very long. But he was subject to being taken for internment, and my mother needed to work in order to pay for her existence. She hadn't been able to take anything out of Germany. Because my mother needed to work, and she couldn't take care of me, I was put into a hostel for refugee children, and I spent 11 months in the hostel. After that, my father was free from any possibility of internment and was able to put the family back together again. I hated the hostel. I have only a couple of moments that I remember, but I remember behaving badly, and I was put behind a bench in the corner of the room where the children were playing, and I stood behind that bench while the other children went out to play. And I remember that incident. And I remember that when I was leaving the hostel, I had a new striped shirt, and I had a cup of cocoa before I left, and I threw up over my striped shirt. So those are the two memories that I have of that hostel. I'm told that I stopped speaking when I was in the hostel, but I have no memory of that. But then the family was together, my older sister, my father and my mother and I, and we were living in a flat in London, and it was under the roof of the building in which we lived. It was a small flat, and when there were air raids at the time of the Battle of Britain, we would go with the other people into the underground, where one would be safe from the air raids, and people spent the whole night in the underground. At a certain point, my mother refused to go into the underground anymore. She hated it. And so we went into the cellar of the building where we lived. And English cellars are very well constructed. And a number of other people were in the cellar. And our house was hit by a bomb. It largely destroyed the building, but no one in the cellar was hurt. Everybody was fine in the cellar, but after that we had no place to live, and people were being evacuated from London. And so the way you were evacuated is you went to one of the train stations in London, and you got on a train, and at each stop of the train, somebody came on board and said, "We can take so many." And so you got off at that point. And we got off at a town about 70 miles from London called Kettering. And Kettering is a boot and shoe manufacturing town. It's a pleasant town of about 30 or 35,000 people, and it has a famous park called Wicksteed Park. Initially, the people who got off the train at Kettering were housed in a school, and my older sister was playing in the schoolyard with a girl from the neighborhood, and the girl apparently asked her parents, could they take my sister in? And the family said yes. And it was not a well-to-do family. The father was a bicycle repairman. The girl told my sister she could come and live with them, and my sister said, "You also have to take my mother and my brother." My father had stayed in London because they only evacuated at that point the women and children. So the family agreed. So the three of us, my older sister, my mother, and I, moved into the home of the bicycle repairman. And then a little later, my father was able to join us, and he also moved in to the house. In a typical English house, there is a front room, and the front room is not used most of the time. It's where some formal occasion takes place, some fancy occasion. But the main room of the house is usually the dining room. But because the front room was empty, we were in the front room of the house. And we lived there for a little while. A town councilman in Kettering had decided to become our protector. His name was Mr. Good, G-O-O-D-E, or Good as it would be pronounced there. And he looked after us. and he wanted to get a job for my father. And he found a job at a milk bottling factory. But the milk bottling factory was far away, and my father did not ride a bicycle. And so Mr. Good found us another house to move into, and this was a more well-to-do home. It was the home of an insurance agent. And we moved into the front room of the insurance agent. And then Mr. Good found us a place of our own to live in Kettering, and helped get my father work teaching languages. And we lived in Kettering. We lived through the war in Kettering, and we later moved to a town nearby because of my father's working arrangements at the school, a town called Northampton, which is the county seat of the area where Kettering is located. And we lived in Northampton for 2.5 years. My older sister, quite young, got married to an American soldier who had been stationed in England. And she came to the United States as a war bride. And so my parents didn't want to lose contact with their only daughter, and so they applied to come to the United States. So that's how we came to the United States. It was not a religious family, but it was a family that very much identified as being Jewish. My parents would go to a synagogue quite often. They celebrated all the Jewish holidays, and they didn't quite keep a kosher household, but they didn't eat pork or shellfish. But mixing meat and milk, that was okay. So it was a very consciously Jewish family, but not really Orthodox or not really religious. But being Jewish was very important to them. It was the way they defined themselves. And I was given a Hebrew name, Aryeh, which means lion. My father had been fired from his job as a teacher because he was Jewish, and was then employed by the Jewish community in Berlin, and was a teacher under their auspices. So they talked about Germany. They weren't born in Germany. They were born in what is today Poland. They lived in a place which they tended to refer to as Drei Kaiser Ecke, where the three empires, the Prussian, the Austrian, and the Russian Empire came together. And my father, as a child, earned some money smuggling cigarettes across these borders. And my father was born in 1899, and after the war, after World War I, he wanted to leave to go for an education, and he went to Berlin to get an education. And after he left, sometime later, my mother joined him in Berlin. So they got married in Berlin, and then lived in Berlin until they went to England. my mother, originally my mother's family had 11 children. 8 survived into adulthood. And of the 8, 5 died during the war in different concentration camps. A brother survived, and he had lived in Berlin for a period, but he had gone to what is now Israel before the war. And a sister survived in Poland. The sister survived because her husband was very capable of living in the woods. He had the skills and the strength and whatnot to survive in that way. And so, although he died at the end of the war, he kept his wife alive during the war. So she survived in Poland during the war. And then after the war, a few years later, she was able to migrate from Poland to Israel. But the only family then got to be the family of my mother's brother, who had gone to Israel. We didn't have any. We had distant relatives in Western countries. We actually learned what happened to members of my father was an only child, so he didn't have any brothers or sisters. We learned about what happened to my mother's family because she had a cousin who had gone to Canada, and he worked for an organization called the Joint Distribution Committee. And he had looked into what happened to the family. And one day, completely unexpectedly, we had had no contact with him. He turned up at our house in Northampton, England, and told us what had happened to various members of the family. Up to that point, we didn't know anything about what happened to various members of the family. I came to the United States, and I went to this high school called Stuyvesant High School. And I attended the school from 1950 to 1954. That was a period, that was precisely the period in which Senator Joseph McCarthy was a significant figure in the United States. He made his famous speech denouncing communists in the State Department in 1950. And his decline came in 1954 in what were called the Army McCarthy hearings. In that period, everybody in the United States was caught up in discussions of McCarthyism. And at my school, there were a couple of teachers who were called before congressional investigations. And so we were very conscious of McCarthyism in that period. The school was overcrowded, and so it was divided into 2 sessions. In the first 2 years, one attended classes from 1 in the afternoon until 5:30. And in the last 2 years, one attended classes from 8 in the morning until 12:30. So in my last 2 years of school, I had the entire afternoon off. In school, there was something called the History Club. And we were called the History Club because the teacher who was the advisor was a history teacher. And this was the setting for discussions of political developments. And I became the president of the History Club. And so in my role as president of the History Club, I arranged activities, and because we had the afternoon free, we could invite speakers to events that would take place in the afternoon. So students who attended from 8 to 12:30 would then have lunch, and then there would be an event of the History Club. So I invited the local member of Congress. I invited various other people who would be of interest. And because the school was particularly well known and located here in Manhattan, convenient to various public figures, it was quite easy to get the speakers that I wanted to bring to the school. And so one of the issues of concern at that point was ratification of the Genocide Convention. And so I wrote a letter to Lemkin at the address of the UN, which reached him, and then he invited me to come and see him at the Delegates Lounge. And I told him what I wanted, and he agreed to come to the school to talk about American ratification of the Genocide Convention. We didn't have any money, and so the question of going to university was an issue. We had come from Germany to England with nothing, and we had come from England to the United States with almost nothing. So there wasn't any money in the family. So I found a way to go to university without significant expense. One of the universities in the United States, one of the well-known universities, is Cornell University. Cornell University is principally a private university, but there are also a number of departments that are publicly supported by, or were supported, and still are supported by the state of New York. And one of the divisions that was supported by the state of New York is the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Tuition was free at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And once one entered the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, one's coursework was largely voluntary, so one could take a liberal arts curriculum and have no cost for tuition. In addition, New York State had scholarships for students who attended universities within New York State, and these scholarships were awarded on a competitive basis. You took a test, and depending on how you did in the test, you got one of those scholarships. So I also got one of the state scholarships. And then while I was at Cornell, I also worked. I worked at jobs on the college campus while I was a student, and the School of Industrial and Labor Relations found me jobs for the summers. So between free tuition, a state scholarship, and what I earned, going to college cost my parents nothing. I could cover the cost myself. So that's where I went to school. And while I was at Cornell, I also became active in political matters and matters involving rights. I didn't have memory myself of the Third Reich, but I was aware of my family's situation. I was aware of the number of people in my family who had been killed, and that had a big effect on me. But it sort of combined with the effect of having gone to high school, to secondary school during the McCarthy period. And the two things came together and made me somebody who was interested in rights. And the rights issues I got involved in at Cornell, the two biggest issues were that in January 1955, I started Cornell in September 1954. In January 1955, there was the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a refusal by the blacks in Montgomery, Alabama, to ride the buses because the buses were segregated. And the first article I ever wrote for the Cornell newspaper was about the Montgomery bus boycott. And the other issue that loomed largest for me was that in 1956 there was the Hungarian Revolution against the Soviet Union. And there was a speaker on the Cornell campus, a man named Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas had been the socialist candidate for president 6 times. I think the last time was, I don't remember whether it was 1956 or 1960, but he was the socialist candidate for president. And he had been a founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, and he was a socialist, very anti-communist. And he spoke, and he was a great public speaker, probably the finest public speaker I ever heard in my life. He spoke at the Cornell campus, and there must have been 3,000 students in the hall to hear him. And after his speech, he went to one of the houses on the campus, and a certain number of people who wanted to talk further went there. And I was one of those who went there. And he said that he had just had a visit from a woman named Anna Ketley. Anna Ketley was the foreign minister appointed by the Hungarian government during the period of revolution from the Soviet Union. She was appointed by Imre Nagy, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And Anna Ketley was a socialist, anti-communist like Norman Thomas. And when she arrived in New York at what was then called Idlewild Airport, before it was called Kennedy Airport, she went directly from the airport to Norman Thomas's office. And she talked to him about the Hungarian Revolution. And the next night he was to speak at Cornell. And when we went and gathered at the house and listened to him, he talked about the Hungarian Revolution. So that was also an important event for me. And after I listened to Norman Thomas, I went to a few faculty members I knew at Cornell and asked them if they would become advisors if I established an organization on the Cornell campus to bring different speakers to the Cornell campus. We called it the Cornell Forum. I was the president of the Cornell Forum. And Norman Thomas had been, before he was a candidate for president, he had directed an organization called the League for Industrial Democracy, founded in 1905, a socialist anti-communist organization. And it had a student organization. And the student organization had chapters at a few other universities, at Yale, at Harvard, at a couple of other institutions. And they had organized events dealing with the Hungarian Revolution. So I affiliated it with the Student League for Industrial Democracy. And then I became part of that group, and I became, a year later, I became president of the national organization. The person who preceded me died a few years ago, but he was an American publisher named Andrei Shefrin, a well-known American publisher. And he was a student at Yale and had headed the group from there. And then I succeeded him and became the president of the Student League for Industrial Democracy. So I was involved in these activities both in secondary school and high school and in college. You know, I have a copy of Animal Farm at home, and I didn't have much money, but I bought the book when it was initially published. And if I look at it, it's the first edition, I think, printed in the United States in 1953. And Animal Farm, and later 1984, but Animal Farm made an enormous impression on me during that period. And a lot of the literature that I read during that period had a significant political element. There were books by André Malraux, there were Albert Camus, there was George Bernanos, there were all the literature of engagement from France that I read during that period. And I liked those books a great deal and learned a great deal from that. So if Malraux wrote a book like Man's Fate, that made a big impression on me. In my high school, the teacher who was the advisor to this history club, Mrs. Brody, certainly had a significant influence on me. When I went to college, there were a few members of the Cornell faculty who had influence on me. There were 2 or 3 faculty members in what was called the government department. One was a man named Clinton Rossiter, who became a well-known figure in the United States. And among other things, at a certain point, there was a series of books commissioned by something called the Fund for the Republic on communism in American life, which discussed communism in labor unions, communism in various other settings. He was the editor of that series of books. Another government professor at Cornell was a man named Mario Einaudi. His father, Luigi Einaudi, was president of Italy at one point. But Mario Einaudi had a big effect on me. And then there was a younger faculty member in the government department named Andrew Hacker, who is still alive. He's a few years older than I am. And until 2 or 3 years ago, one would always find his articles in the New York Review of Books. But Andrew Hacker was an influence. In the labor relations school, there were 2 women who had a big influence on me. One was a woman named Alice Cook, and she was a labor historian. And for a period, she had teaching with her a woman who played an important role in American history. The woman was a woman named Frances Perkins, and she had been the first woman who ever served in the cabinet of the United States. She was very close to Franklin Roosevelt, served as Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt, and was generally considered the person who pushed the various laws that became the New Deal. That Franklin Roosevelt was very heavily influenced by Frances Perkins. But after she retired, she came to live at Cornell and became a friend and was a friend of this professor of labor history, Alice Cook, and joined Alice Cook in the teaching at Cornell. And then there was another woman, a woman named Jean McKelvey, who was also a figure. And then there was, at the Labor Relations School, a man named Milton Konvitz. And he was somebody who taught American constitutional law to undergraduates at Cornell. And I very much enjoyed his classes. And I became personally friendly with all of these faculty members. Students have limited ability at large universities to become friendly with faculty members, but I became friendly with all of them. And they all had significant influences on me. And then aside from Norman Thomas, another speaker I had heard at Cornell was a man named Arthur Garfield Hayes. He was a lawyer associated with the American Civil Liberties Union, general counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union. And I became very interested in the American Civil Liberties Union, in part through listening to Arthur Garfield Hayes. The American Civil Liberties Union is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary. It was founded in January 1920. It actually, there was a predecessor organization during World War I called the Civil Liberties Bureau. And that organization had been created to defend people who opposed American entry into World War I or opposed the draft. And a lot of those people were sentenced to long terms in prison. 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years in prison. World War I was probably the most repressive period in American history, or the 1917-1918 period when the United States was engaged in World War I. During much of that period, the president, Woodrow Wilson, was not functioning very well. His attorney general was a man named A. Mitchell Palmer, who was a repressive figure. There was also violence by anarchists during World War I. And in 1919, after World War I, anarchists blew up the home of A. Mitchell Palmer. The only person who was injured was the person who carried the bomb, who was killed. Nobody else was injured, but there was a violent period. And after the war, there were letter bombings, and in one letter bombing, the secretary of a senator lost her hand opening a package. So there was anarchist violence in that era. But there were also people who were peaceful opponents of entry into the war and peaceful opponents of the draft during that period, who were treated very harshly. Initially, the organization was seen as a temporary organization while the war existed, but because the attacks on civil liberties continued after the end of the war, a permanent organization, the American Civil Liberties Union, was established. And in the 100 years since the establishment of the American Civil Liberties Union, it has been the most important organization in the United States protecting individual rights. Today it's a very, very large organization. It has about 1.5 million members. It has a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It has offices with staff attorneys every place in the United States, all 50 states, and in many states, many offices. And it handles thousands of court cases each year, and it's also active lobbying in Congress and in a variety of other ways to protect civil liberties. And I was pleased. It was much smaller when I first got involved. When I got involved, it had 60,000 members. It had state affiliates in about half the states, and staffed offices in about 15 cities around the United States. But I went to work for the organization in 1963. I was 26. I went to work as field director. And a year and a half later, I became the director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, dealing with New York State. And then 5 years after that, in 1970, I became the national executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, which I did until 1978. So altogether, I worked for the organization from 1963 to 1978, 15 years. And the last 8 years as the national executive director. And I was much more well known as a figure then than any time since then. The American Civil Liberties Union had always defended freedom of speech for everyone, even in the period leading up to World War II, when there were Nazis in the United States, or supporters of fascism in the United States, or communists in the United States. It had defended freedom of speech for everybody and issued publications in the 1930s about why we defend freedom of speech for everyone. So this was the well-established point of view of the organization. In the period before I joined the staff of the American Civil Liberties Union, there was a very well-publicized case involving freedom of speech for Nazis here in New York City. The most famous American Nazi had been a man named George Lincoln Rockwell. And Rockwell, at one point, sought a permit for a demonstration in Union Square Park in New York City. And the city turned him down for that. And the American Civil Liberties Union had represented him and got him the right to hold a demonstration and to speak in Union Square Park. That case took place in 1960, and I joined the staff of the ACLU in 1963. So I was very familiar with the fact that the ACLU defended free speech for everyone. And during the period that I was director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, we had been involved in a number of cases involving Rockwell and people of a similar variety. The Skokie case took place somewhat later, when I was the national executive director of the ACLU. It started in 1977, and the case involved a group calling itself American Nazis, and they had originally demonstrated in the city of Chicago, and they had focused on an area of Chicago called Marquette Park. Marquette Park is a small park in Chicago. One side of the park has a population, or then had a population, that was predominantly African American. The other side of the park had a population that was predominantly made up of East European immigrants, Lithuanians, Poles, etc. And there was racial tension between those two groups. And the Nazis originally held their demonstrations in Marquette Park to try to exploit those divisions. They had been banned from holding the demonstration in Marquette Park by a court order. And the Nazis came to the Chicago office of the ACLU and asked for representation, and the Chicago office agreed. And it was considered a routine matter. And during the period that the Nazis could not demonstrate in Marquette Park, they wrote letters to different suburbs of Chicago saying, we want to demonstrate in your community. And all but one of those suburbs ignored the letters. And Skokie didn't ignore the letter. it said, "Don't you dare come here." And the Skokie Town Council quickly adopted a number of laws, ordinances, to make it impossible for the Nazis to demonstrate. They would have to post a $350,000 bond to cover any damage. Nobody could be permitted to parade in uniform. There was one other ordinance of that sort they adopted.
How many were they, the Nazis?
About 15 or 20. So the Nazis then decided they would demonstrate in Skokie, but they went back to the ACLU when these ordinances were adopted, and the Chicago ACLU agreed that they would represent them. It was considered so routine a matter that the Chicago ACLU didn't bother to let us know in the national office in New York that this was going on. This was just something standard. And then suddenly the press discovered this incident. And the issue that became the press story is that Skokie was a town of about 40,000 people, and about 7,000 people in Skokie could more or less be described as Holocaust survivors. An unusual number had come to this one place, and that became the issue in the press. And so I hadn't known about the case until it became a press story. And so I went to Chicago to talk to our people there and agreed that we would back them up in this. And it became a bigger and bigger story. And a number of court cases emerged out of this. And there was a newspaper story about the Skokie case every day, some new element of it. And I started getting invitations to speak at a great many places about Skokie, and I particularly accepted the speaking invitations from different synagogues. And I spoke at a great many synagogues. And I got such an invitation from Skokie, from a synagogue, and I spoke at the synagogue in Skokie. The discussion of the case was very interesting. Initially, most people were opposed to the position of the American Civil Liberties Union. Over time, that changed. Over time, as people discussed the matter more and more, the free speech side of the argument got to be stronger, and more people were persuaded of it. Over time, I would say most Americans probably would agree today that the ACLU did the right thing. I'm not sure what the outcome would be, but it would be either most Americans or it would be close if any poll were taken on that subject today. As people debated the issue, the free speech side got stronger. One of the things I would do is when I spoke, I would ask people, how many of you have taken part in dinner table debates over Skokie? And almost all the hands would go up. Everybody had argued about it. And the free speech side got stronger in those arguments that took place over the dinner table. And eventually what happened is that we had won all the court cases, and the demonstration could go forward. And then the day the demonstration was supposed to take place, the Nazis didn't show up. And not long thereafter, I mean, they did hold a demonstration in Marquette Park where they had originally wanted to demonstrate, but they only had a handful of people who came to that. And after that, the Nazi group dissolved and no one ever heard of them again. And there were some nasty things that took place along the way. There had been a radical American rabbi who then became a radical rabbi in Israel named Meir Kahan. And Kahan held demonstrations, including on one occasion inside the ACLU offices in New York. And he wanted us to call the police to throw him out. That would have been good publicity for him. We managed to get rid of him without that. My home phone number is unlisted, and people didn't have my address, but apparently a group of the Jewish Defense League followed me home on one occasion and found out where I lived and held demonstrations at my apartment building. But there is an entrance to the building where I live that is on a different block, which is an entrance for a garage in the basement of the building. So for a period, my wife and I were using the garage entrance to the building to avoid the demonstrators who were in front of the building. At one point, the Jewish Defense League presented me with a gift, which was a kind of board with a lampshade on it and what looked like blood on it, and things like that. So there were things like that that took place. The key court decision in the United States is a case from 1969 called Brandenburg versus Ohio. And Brandenburg involved a rally by the Ku Klux Klan in Ohio. And the Klan members had been convicted on the basis of incitement. And the Supreme Court ruling said that you can convict someone for incitement only in circumstances in which incitement is likely to lead to the actual crime being committed. One example I used to use is one of our Supreme Court justices famously said that freedom of speech doesn't cover the right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theater. And I tell people that the most important word in that is the word crowded. That if you go into an empty theater and you shout fire falsely, nothing will happen. But if you go into a crowded theater, then a panic is likely to take place and people would get injured. So you have to be concerned about the context and not only the content. The content of speech is what people say. The context is one which deals with the circumstances in which the speech takes place. And if the circumstances are such that violence is likely to take place, or if you take, for example, a lynch mob, and there's an atmosphere that someone is about to get lynched and someone who's a speaker says, "Go get him, string him up." And in those circumstances, the speaker himself has not engaged in any violence, but the speaker has incited people in circumstances in which the violence is likely to take place. And so the speaker in that circumstance can be punished. But if it's on a New York street and somebody stands on the street and says, "Go get him, lynch him," everybody will sort of, walk away. No violence will take place. So you have to be concerned with the context of speech as well as the content. And I think that's probably the main difference between American law on speech and European law on speech. The context is not a crucial factor in European law. See, that's an area that is similar to the free speech issues that arise in terms of the internet, that you say something over the internet and it goes to the whole world, and you don't know the circumstances in each part of the world. And that creates a difficulty that I never encountered when I dealt with these kinds of issues. It's a very difficult area, and I don't have a well-defined view on the internet incitement issues. In the American context, the fact that it's art would not be a significant factor. The factor that would matter is whether there is an immediate relationship between some violation of law that the state has a right to prevent and the speech. If the speech is directly connected to violence or then that would be not protected speech. If the speech takes place, let's say, in the hiring of an employee, and it leads to discrimination at that moment, that would not be protected. But unless there is some direct and immediate consequence that involves a violation of law, speech would be protected in the United States. And speech of all sorts takes place at all times in the United States. We have a very strong commitment to freedom of speech in the United States. Well, if a person is acting in an official capacity, there are more restraints, or there should be more restraints on the person than if the person is acting in a private capacity. So one denounces a Trump for those kinds of things. But there isn't. But unless he actually commits a violation of law, there's really nothing one can do about it. And if he does commit a violation of law, the question is then who is going to act in such a case? And that's something that free speech law doesn't really address. No, you see, a circumstance in which I consider that he has incited in circumstances where violence could take place is when he has been at rallies and he has, in effect, called on people to beat up somebody who is annoying him with the question they asked or with the position they espouse, then he's really crossing the line in terms of incitement, because violence really could take place under those circumstances. I'm not sure how to define the principle of solidarity as a legal concept. It's very difficult. What does it actually mean? What obligation does it impose on anyone? I'm a very strong believer in resistance. You know, I have the picture of Hannah Arendt there. Hannah Arendt is most controversial for her Eichmann in Jerusalem book, and there she is highly critical of the Jewish leadership in Nazi-occupied Europe for not leading the resistance to the Nazis. So I very strongly support her position on it. But can you then hold accountable those people who do not resist or do not provide leadership? I don't think you can. If they are frightened or if they think that it'll make matters worse if they resist, they may be wrong about saying that it'll make matters worse, but they may be right about that. And I don't think you can hold them accountable. I think you can advocate resistance. A great believer, the German philosopher who wrote about guilt at the end of World War II. Jaspers. Karl Jaspers. Now, Jaspers divides guilt into 4 categories. He deals with political guilt, he deals with moral guilt, he deals with metaphysical guilt, and I'm forgetting the 4th category. But in effect, his position becomes this, that only one of those, that only guilt which actually involves participation in the crimes can be criminal guilt. And criminal guilt, from his standpoint, is always individual, whereas political guilt and metaphysical guilt and moral guilt are collective, and they cannot be prosecuted as crimes. You can be critical of people for these collective forms of guilt, but you can only actually punish those who are criminally guilty, who are guilty on an individual basis. And I think I generally would accept the Jaspers point of view. I left the American Civil Liberties Union in 1978, mainly because I was tired. I had been I've been working there for 15 years, and one of the duties of the person who directs the organization is to raise funds. And I was spending too much of my time raising funds. And so I decided to leave in 1978. I actually would have left a little bit earlier, But I couldn't leave while the Skokie case was underway because that would have indicated that I was somehow pushed out or felt I had to leave because of that. So I had to wait until that was over. Initially, my thought was to simply take it easy for a while. And so I became a visiting professor of law at New York University, and I also became associated with a humanities institute at New York University and directed the Humanities Institute. Around the time that I left the American Civil Liberties Union, a friend of mine was in the process of organizing what became the Helsinki Watch, which was simply concerned with abuses in the Soviet bloc countries and initially principally the Soviet Union. And he was the head of a large publishing firm, the largest publishing firm in the United States, Random House. And he asked me to join him. And he became the chairman, I became the vice chairman of the Helsinki Watch. And I was active in that while I was teaching at New York University Law School and at the Humanities Institute. And then in 1980, November 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. And the previous president, Jimmy Carter, had tried to promote human rights internationally. Reagan was turning his back on efforts to promote human rights. And at that point, it seemed to me that the human rights issue was going to become a large factor, provided that instead of just focusing on the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries, we would be engaged worldwide. And I decided to expand the organization into a worldwide organization, piece by piece. I didn't think we could deal with the whole world at once. There was too much to do. So I thought if we took on one region of the world and then another, that would be the way to do it. And Reagan was particularly contradicting the Carter human rights policy in Latin America. So I started with Latin America and created an America's Watch. And 2 or 3 years later, an Asia Watch, and then an Africa Watch, and then a Middle East Watch. So altogether, it took about 10 years until I felt I could operate on a global basis. And when it became global, I used the name Human Rights Watch rather than the individual names of the different regions. When I decided to deal with Latin America and the Americas Watch, I needed to find people who were particularly expert on human rights in Latin America. And I needed to have a board that was knowledgeable about issues in Latin America. And I could do that one area at a time. I couldn't do it all at once. Yes, I asked people who I knew, who do you respect most in terms of human rights in Latin America? And I got different names, and one of the names I got was an Argentine lawyer named Juan Mendez. And I went to see Juan Mendez and persuaded him to join the staff. Juan Mendez had been a lawyer in Argentina. He had defended political prisoners. When the military dictatorship was in power, he himself had been seized. He was a disappeared person. He survived because when he was a high school student in Argentina, he had taken part in an exchange program where he lived with a family from Iowa in the United States. And when he disappeared, his Argentine family called his Iowa family. And his Iowa family called went to see the members of Congress from Iowa and the neighboring state of Illinois, and got them active in his case. And that probably kept him alive. And after a year and a half in prison, he was released and came to the United States. Various members of Congress were involved in his case and supported him. And, you know, over the years, he has been a distinguished figure in the human rights field. He became president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights when Kofi Annan was Secretary General of the UN. He was the special advisor to the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. You know, he was the UN rapporteur on torture. So he's had various distinguished positions, and he teaches today at American University Law School. He's about 76 now, but he remains a close friend of mine and a close associate of mine, and we worked together. I introduced him to Kofi Annan, and after he became the special advisor on genocide, after a few months, Kofi Annan called me and told me how grateful he was to me for introducing him to Juan, because Juan was so effective and so good in that role. So he's one of the people I found who I feel he may be at the top of the list of the people, but I found people for other parts of the world. And today, Human Rights Watch is quite a large organization, not as big as the American Civil Liberties Union, but it's quite large. And the American Civil Liberties Union limits itself to the United States, whereas Human Rights Watch deals with the whole world. Amnesty International was founded in 1961. The first part of Human Rights Watch, the Helsinki Watch, was 1978, and then took 10 years until we became global. When Human Rights Watch was created, Amnesty had a very limited agenda. It was concerned with prisoners of conscience and torture. And then it had added a concern with capital punishment. Human Rights Watch took a much broader approach. The most important innovation at Human Rights Watch is that we concerned ourselves with violations of the laws of war, that is, international humanitarian law. At that stage, Amnesty didn't do anything on laws of war, violations of the laws of war. Many years later, it took that on, but it resisted taking on international humanitarian law. Human Rights Watch also dealt with violations of rights that didn't involve political abuses, so that women's rights issues or gay rights issues or rights to a fair trial for ordinary persons, or rights of prisoners who were not political prisoners but ordinary prisoners. So Human Rights Watch had a much broader agenda than Amnesty. Over time, Amnesty changed, and today there isn't a significant difference between the agenda of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. But in those days, it was completely different. Another thing is that initially Human Rights Watch was an American organization, and it was concerned with American foreign policy and the way American foreign policy affects human rights. Amnesty wouldn't deal with that in those days. Amnesty took the position that it would only deal with American foreign policy if it could also deal with Soviet foreign policy, and it couldn't deal with Soviet foreign policy or Chinese foreign policy, so it didn't deal with American foreign policy. Human Rights Watch immediately focused very much on how American foreign policy affects human rights. It also tries to deal with everybody else and how their policies affect human rights. Human Rights Watch today, incidentally, has had a very, very good relationship with Angela Merkel. And Ken Roth, my successor, is always, he meets her, maybe once a year or once every 2 years. But he's always very enthusiastic about his meetings with her. Over time, NGOs, I think, have become more important. That there was a period in which NGOs did not play a significant role in public policy. I think the earliest NGOs to play a significant role in public policy, and the earliest human rights efforts really were the anti-slavery efforts that developed in England starting in the latter part of the 18th century, and then in the United States in the 19th century. And I think the anti-slavery movement essentially was an NGO movement that led to government policy. And so, England abolished slavery first in the colonies, and then abolished the slave trade and abolished slavery in England itself. And the United States did so somewhat later, and NGOs played a critical role in that. But NGOs in the United States began to play a broader role at the beginning of the 20th century. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded in the United States in 1909, and the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. And those became the principal NGOs dealing with rights here in the United States. There was a civil liberties organization in England during World War I, led by people like Bertrand Russell, and they were concerned with the rights of conscientious objectors to participation in the war. And then the English organization disappeared after World War I, and then was recreated in 1934. And today there's an organization in the United Kingdom called Liberty, which is the same organization as the National Council for Civil Liberties, created in 1934. But there had been this gap between about 1920 and 1934 in the United Kingdom. In France, there was a human rights organization created in the 1890s as a result of the Dreyfus case. And the Fédération in France is an outgrowth of the Dreyfus case. And in 1922, it established an international organization. And it did have a certain number of prominent people from other European countries who were associated with the Fédération. So that in Italy, for example, Matteotti, who was murdered by Mussolini, was associated with the Fédération. In Germany, Karl von Ossietzky, who received the Nobel Prize and who reported on German rearmament, was a member of the Fédération. After Karl von Ossietzky won the Nobel Prize, Hitler decreed that no German could ever receive a Nobel Prize. So, you know, in Spain, I think Miguel Unamuno was a member of the Fédération. In the United States, efforts to establish international human rights came about during World War II. What happened is that there were a certain number of French exiles in the United States who had been associated with the Fédération in France. The leader of the Fédération in France was murdered by the Nazis. I'm forgetting his name. But there were some members of the group in the United States. And they contacted a man named Roger Baldwin, and he had been the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union and was still the leader, still the director of the American Civil Liberties Union. And they joined with him to create an organization called the International League for Human Rights. It was first called the International League for the Rights of Man, and then they changed it to include women, and it became the International League for Human Rights. And that was active at the time of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was an organization supporting ratification of the Genocide Convention. I consider that the anti-slavery people invented human rights. And I feel that way for the following reasons. First, the anti-slavery movement was international and had to be international because slaves were imported from one country to another. And the second thing about the anti-slavery movement is that a lot of the people involved were engaged in those efforts altruistically. That is, they weren't concerned with their own rights, they were concerned with the rights of others. And to me, the essence of the human rights movement is to be concerned with the rights of others. That is, you can go back throughout history and find people concerned with their own rights. But what is novel about the anti-slavery movement is there were people concerned altruistically about the rights of others. I spent 10 days in Cuba in 1978 and spent the entire time visiting prisons. And I wrote quite a lot about that. I wrote articles for the New York Review of Books about the prisons in Cuba and about human rights generally in Cuba. The worst period in Cuba was actually in the 2 or 3 years after the revolution, in that very early period. We don't know how many executions there were, but most people who follow this tend to think there were about 5,000 executions in that period. Yeah, I was not allowed to go to Cuba before 1978, and I would not be allowed into Cuba after that. But in that one moment, I was able to go. I never really thought I would be very good at politics. I had one experience, which was somewhat a political experience. When I was director of the New York Civil Liberties Union in 1966, we had a referendum in New York about whether there should be civilian review of complaints against the police. And I was the director of the effort to have civilian review. And we had a large operation, and I had enlisted many important figures on my side of the debate. And I persuaded myself that we would succeed. And we lost by a margin in percentage terms of 63 to 37%. That was my one experience in a campaign that involved the general public. And if I ever thought about being active politically, that one experience deterred me from going further along those lines. I'm a member of a political party, but that's to be able to vote in primary elections, but I never was active in the political party. Look, I think that you cannot protect human rights except with the rule of law. And rule of law means everything to me. So I've never seen the polarization of opinion greater than we have today in the United States, but all over the world. The polarization is extreme today. I've never met her, but when my successor at Human Rights Watch speaks admiringly of her, he says that when he meets with her, he finds a decent human being. When he says something, and something she doesn't know about, she will answer, I didn't know that. And he said, politicians never respond.
Never say, I didn't know that.
I mean, just, a different kind of person than the other people in positions of power with whom he deals. Oh, and look, and she has acted also in very many individual cases, so that I'm aware of efforts she has made on behalf of particular victims of human rights abuse. I mean, if I were to say one case that concerns me most at this moment, I have a friend in Turkey, a businessman named Osman Kavala. And Osman is a well-to-do man, a philanthropist in Turkey, great supporter of minority rights in Turkey, and also supporter of cultural programs, so that a typical sort of act of his is establishing a cultural center in Diyarbakir, the city where the main city of the Kurdish population in Turkey. And it's now more than 2 years since he has been in prison in Istanbul. And Erdogan accuses him of financing the protests that took place in 2013 over a spot in Istanbul called Gezi Park. And Erdogan regards that as a preliminary coup attempt. It's absurd. But Osman Kavala has been in prison for more than 2 years on these charges. There hasn't been a trial. I know that Angela Merkel has, spoken to Erdogan about this case more than once, and there are many cases like that worldwide where she has intervened, so that when the wife of Liu Xiaobo arrived in Berlin, she was photographed with her arms like that, and that was because of Angela Merkel's dealing with Xi Jinping. So she has been, as world leaders are concerned, more active on individual human rights cases than anybody else. The closest to it has been Canada and Trudeau, but Angela Merkel has been the most active leader in this area. I haven't developed my own sort of policy with respect to the internet. Part of it is I'm, relatively speaking, a technological ignoramus. I've never participated in social media, for example, never once. And I have a feeling that one should know more about the technology than I do if one is going to propose policies that are meaningful with respect to the internet. So I think I have to leave it to others to take the lead. And I haven't seen anybody propose policies which sort of seem to me the right approach. I may simply not know. I don't know enough in this area. I don't have one person I could call the most important defender of human rights. I can think of people in different parts of the world who I consider to be the most important defenders of human rights in that part of the world. If I think of, Russia and the Soviet Union, I think of two people. I think of a woman named Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who died not so long ago at the age of 90 or 91. She was a friend of mine. She lived in the United States for a number of years, and we became friends during that period. And when she went back to the Soviet Union in the latter part of Gorbachev's tenure, I went to visit her in Moscow, and I saw her there many times. And when I stepped down from the position of president of this foundation, even though she was then 85, she traveled to Budapest to take part in a dinner for me. But Lyudmila Alexeyeva would have been very much. And then another person, Sergei Kovalev, who is still alive, who is also about 90 today. He had been a microbiologist, and he was an early dissident and was the principal person in publishing something called the Chronicle of Current Events, which was the best information source on repression in the Soviet Union. And he served 7 years in prison, and thereafter was in internal exile in Siberia. So he stands out in the former Soviet bloc countries. Adam Michnik in Poland is a friend of mine, and I saw him here recently. Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. In China, I never met Liu Xiaobo, but I knew about him for a very long period. I had known that he was here in the United States teaching at Columbia when Tiananmen Square took place, and went back to China and was there at the time of the military crackdown on Tiananmen Square, and probably saved a lot of lives at that moment, because the students who had occupied Tiananmen Square gathered at the monument in Tiananmen Square, and the debate was whether they should leave or whether they should stay to confront the military. And he said, let's take a vote, and he presided. And he said those who had voted to leave had the majority. And so almost all the students actually left the square, and they survived as a result of that. But everything I knew about Liu Xiaobo, I admired immensely. If I think of Latin America, there are a number of people who, there's a man who's still alive in Chile named Jose Zalaquet. Do you know that name?
Mm-hmm.
Have you met him?
No, never. I would like to meet him.
He's not well. He's had cancer, and he's in bad physical condition today. But he really played an immensely valuable role in Chile. And in Argentina, a man named Emilio Mignone, he was the founder of an organization called CELS in Argentina. He had been a rector of a university. His daughter disappeared, and after his daughter disappeared, he stepped down from his post as the rector of a university and founded what became the leading human rights organization in Argentina. And there was nothing anybody could do to him after his daughter disappeared. There was no way to intimidate him because the worst thing had already happened to him. But he played an immensely important role in Argentina. In Brazil, the person I particularly admired was Cardinal Arns. Cardinal Arns was the cardinal in Sao Paulo, and he was the principal opponent of the military when the military ruled Argentina, and he documented their crimes. And there's a book called Torture in Brazil, which results from his documentation of their crimes. And to the degree that the church in Latin America, in certain countries, became a strong opponent of human rights abuses, the influence of Cardinal Arns was particularly important. So those are the people in Latin America. If I go to different parts of Africa, I think Archbishop Tutu in South Africa would be one of my heroes. I think he's a marvelous human being, and also has a great sense of humor. But I think Archbishop Tutu at every point played a critical role in resisting apartheid in South Africa. You could go to other parts of Africa, and I'd pick other people, but yeah.
Thank you.
And I didn't know Liu Xiaobo, but I've had the privilege of knowing a lot of the people I particularly admire.